Well, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our continual move through our criminal law course here. We're just about wrapping up. We got one more chapter to go before we actually start the offenses. Again, there'll be a concentration a little bit on North Carolina law there when we get to those offenses. But right now, we're still clearing away the groundwork here. We're looking at the punishments today with some focus on North Carolina. One of the things we do, or I do, in this course is try to make the text and the slides a little bit more relevant to those students here at Wake Tech, because this course is being prepared for students at Wake Tech who is taking the criminal law. Okay, so we're going to jump in now and we're going to talk about criminal punishments. Of course, somewhat unique, I guess, if we compare it to other aspects of the law. First of all, it's always the state that is prosecuting a crime. We don't have a private prosecution. There's technically something like that, but it's not really done. So the state is involved. The state is involved in the prosecution. The state is involved judging. And of course, then the state is involved in the punishment of the crime. So jumping into that, let me advance forward here. And that's our learning objectives, not terribly important. Let's talk about punishments used in early England. Of course, the United States is a descendant linguistically, legally, of England. So we brought over the common law. We are part of the common law family of law. So as we start our study of punishment, it's only appropriate that we look at where we came from. So traditionally, a concept, and one of the things I talk to my students about in class is, I always ask them this question. I say, you've heard of what a werewolf is. And almost every student has at least seen a cheesy movie or read a book about a werewolf. And the reason I mentioned werewolf, WEREWOLF, is that the literal translation of werewolf is blood wolf. And to tie this to what we're talking about here in punishment, and trust me, there's a tie, is that in the early law, it was all about atoning for the shedding of blood. And the early terms for this, and these go all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon laws and when the Normans come over 1,000 years ago, was the Wehrgeld. Because the people lived in familiar groups. And if you hurt my cousin, the blood feud was in place. So I would go and hurt your cousin. If you killed someone of my family, I would kill some of your family. And it would go back and forth, and it would create a violent society. So one of the first substitutes for this, and it's really one of the first early punishments, is the Wehrgeld, the blood price. So what would happen is someone would commit a crime. Some family member would commit a crime. It could be a very serious crime like murder. It could be a crime like rape. It could be a crime like you burn down someone's house, which traditionally would call for this blood feud. Well, in its place, we would have a Wehrgeld, a blood price, or blood money. Literally blood gold. But the family would say, okay, as opposed to starting a little mini war between our two families, we will pay you this money. And that was seen as a punishment. Now, of course, fast forward a little bit, particularly as the Normans come over, the king starts to centralize a little bit more power. And one of the things he does is he's perfectly happy to take some of that money, don't get me wrong. But he wants a monopoly on the instruments of power. He wants a monopoly, for example, on the coinage of money. He wants a monopoly on who can have a castle. But he also wants a monopoly on who can inflict capital punishment. So not even the church, a very powerful institution in society in the Middle Ages, had the power to kill or to take life. Only the king did. So there were a lot of crimes that called for what we would call the death penalty, or what they would call a capital offense. And again, only the king could, through his courts, lawfully hang someone, behead someone, or even burn them at the stake. Even if you committed a crime against the church, Like, let's suppose you were a witch. Um, and the church tried you and condemned you in ecclesiastical court. What would happen is, the terminology is, you would be relaxed to the secular arm. You'd be given over to the king, and the king would be the one that would burn you at the stake if you were a witch. So there were lots of crimes that were punishable by killing people. Then there were other crimes to make a physical manifestation of your punishment obvious to everybody. Cropping, which was removing parts of a body, amputation basically. Blinding people, branding people, all these were done. There was also social pressure. Public humiliation was very common. We had, in English society, we had pillories, which were these very often, and this is a little bit later, something located in the middle of the village, and you would be put in a stock or a pillory there. And if you were publicly drunk, you could be kept there, and people were free to see that you were there, insult you. You were basically kind of like handcuffed, but it's through like a wooden box that your head is being held. End result, particularly for immoral acts like drunkenness, because that was seen as a moral failure. Infidelity was seen as a moral failure, although that could be punishable by very severe crimes as well. You were exposed to the public, and you were humiliated or condemned. All right, so that's medieval England all the way through, let's say, the 1600s. But of course, turning now to North Carolina, there were about 20 crimes in early colonial North Carolina. And there's a map, if you will, of North Carolina in 1775. And you'll notice that North Carolina is a relatively late colony of the 13 colonies that are successfully declared their independence in 1776. So we weren't established as early as Massachusetts was with the 1600s, or even South Carolina. We weren't the last of the 13. That was Georgia that got established. But we were pretty late, and we were settled kind of from the north and the south. Some came up, some came down, some came through the valleys. But you'll notice now today we have 100 counties. And you'll notice on that map there is not 100 counties. So it was a small population. But we brought over these ideas from England, and there were lots of crimes for which you could be executed. And those included things like burglary, counterfeiting, arson, rape, all of those. The first recorded execution, now there were probably executions before this, but the first one we have a solid date for is not until 1726, which is only 50 years before the American Revolution. Probably around 50 years or 30 years after the establishment of a permanent colony in North Carolina, because of course there was an attempt to establish the first English-speaking colony here, the Roanoke colony, but it failed. Fast forward a little bit, by the close of the American Civil War, a little bit after 1868, it limited the death penalty to just 4 major crimes. And these were viewed by society as the most serious: murder, somewhat surprising, arson, rape, and burglary. Burglary was seen as an invasion of someone's home. That was very serious. Arson was seen as a threat to everybody, because if my house burned down, particularly in a town, it could spread to yours. Or if you burned down my house in winter and I didn't have family or friends to go to, I could die. So you were frequently executed if we caught you. And then murder and rape. North Carolina did also allow mutilation and dismemberment. We could look at some of the slave codes, both in North Carolina and other places, and it was fairly common to mark or crop slaves who ran away or were disobedient if they weren't killed. This next slide is the sentence of His Majesty's Chief Justice in 1771. So there was a kind of revolt in North Carolina, and the Chief Justice, who was still an Englishman, passed this sentence, this punishment, that you, the captain of the regulators, they were the people that raised the revolt, be drawn to the place of execution, where you are to be hanged by the neck, that you are cut down yet well alive, that your bowels be taken out and burnt before your face, that your head be cut off, your body be divided into four quarters, and this to be at his majesty's disposal. So this was kind of brutal way that they killed people, because the punishment was not just to show everybody it was wrong, it was to inflict the maximum pain, and it was going to set the example. You have that kind of fuzzy slide there, you have someone being drawn and quartered. You notice that there's four horses pulling in four directions, and what's going to happen is they're going to quarter him or pull him apart. And they are going to cut open his stomach and show him his intestines, his bowels, as they said, after a hot hanging. It's very, very brutal. And gradually society kind of looks at this and says, yeah, we're a pretty tough people. We're pretty vindictive, but this is extreme even for us. So one of the first ways that we start to ameliorate punishments is we refer to the Bible. Now, the Bible, of course, can be used to both exacerbate or create punishments, make them worse, but it also can be looked upon as a methodology where society was made more peaceful. One of the first ways people limited or avoided punishment was something called benefit of clergy. So remember I said that the king and the church were kind of separate. Well, another thing is the king couldn't reach into the church and grab someone who was a priest or a bishop or an archbishop or a cardinal or a monk or a nun and punish them. This was called benefit of clergy. If you were a member of the church, remember there was only one church. First it's the Catholic Church, although it was really just the church in the Middle Ages. After the Reformation, there is most of the time a single church in England, thanks to Henry VIII. If you are a member of the clergy, you are not subject to the civil law. This really starts late Middle Ages, becomes very popular, and even in North Carolina, this was recognized that if you were a member of the clergy, you couldn't be punished by royal courts for your first felony conviction. Now, there were other ways to get there. So this kind of said, all right, you can't treat people who are somehow sanctified by God in the same way that you would treat the general public. Now, it doesn't help everybody, but it puts a limit. The next thing, and when I'm talking about this in class, usually what comes up is the cartoon, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. If you recall in that, Esmeralda, the gypsy, was being pursued by a mob for something she didn't do. And she runs to the Cathedral of Notre Dame and she claims sanctuary. If you could get to a church or a monastery and you could get in there, the king had no right to enter, because remember, there's this separation between church and state. The king had no right to go into the church, into the monastery, and bring you out. Now, this is a right that really didn't come over with us. Excuse me. This is a right that really didn't come over with us from England. But there is kind of an idea here where there is a through line. If you think about it today, we're having this problem with the border that people are focusing on. And it is a major problem. The major problem is we have a rule that says if you get to the American border and you are in legitimate fear, well-founded fear of persecution, that you're afraid or you're going to be persecuted, if you get here, we're going to let you in. That's the right of asylum. And part of this, I think, is a reaction against what happened to the Jews prior to the Second World War. Prior to the Second World War, several attempts were made for Jews to flee Nazi Germany and occupied Europe, and many countries simply turned them away. And then after the war, they found out that these people that were turned away, that were seeking asylum because they were going to be persecuted, were killed. There's a very famous case about a liner, a ocean liner called I believe it was called the St. Louis. The book is called Ship of Fools, but in any event, it sailed from Nazi Germany, tried to get in the United States, really couldn't. And this got very popularized, and people said, well, we can't let this happen again if we're going to give people the right of asylum. Another punishment that was done somewhat was transportation. So we're almost up to the point of getting to America. I know we're about 20 or 8 slides into a 28-slide lecture, but we're still working our way through punishments. But transportation was the idea that if you were convicted in America and in England, that we wouldn't keep you around since you're a criminal, but we had need of labor in the overseas colonies, or England did. So you would be put on a boat and you would be forcibly settled in one of these colonies. It was very, very rough. So the first convicts were actually sent to America in the 1650s. And by the time the American Revolution rolls around, England is expelling or transporting more than 2,000 convicts a year. In fact, if you go down to Georgia, the entire state of Georgia was founded as a penal colony. That the people convicted of crimes in England were going to be shipped to Georgia. Now, 1776 rolls around. Georgia becomes one of the colonies that revolts. That's no longer available to the English, so they have to look for other places. And some of these places are really horrendous. There's a couple instances where people are sentenced to transportation in England to some of these really horrible islands. You know, the French, for example, is I believe it's called Devil's Island in French Guiana. But there are a few places where convicts are sentenced to transportation. They hear where they're going to be sent, and they said, well, kill me instead of send me there. After the American Revolution ends, the English keep this up for at least another 100-odd years, and the biggest place they send them is Australia. So about 100,000 people are sent from England to Australia as convicts, and this goes on all the way through the 1800s. All right, so now let's start narrowing our focus a little bit more. Let's come back to colonial America. Capital punishment, very draconian. And the big thing in America in the pre-revolution is people needed labor. There was lots of land, there was lots of opportunity, but there weren't lots of workers. So people much preferred, instead of killing someone who could work for you, making him a slave. Now, there were capital crimes. There was lots of corporal punishment. But there was more of a tendency to put people to work. And there becomes a real struggle now between two entities. It's recognized that the executive branch, if we divide up the government into the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, okay, the executive is going to carry out things. It's going to do what it's told to do, right? The legislative branch is going to set the rules about punishment, maybe, and the judiciary is going to set the punishment. It's going to apply it. Well, between those two, there's a real struggle. The judiciary wants the authority to say, this is the punishment, we're going to do this. Or, yeah, he violated the law, but we're going to suspend the punishment. We're not going to suspend it. Now, conversely, the legislature wanted that power. The legislature said, and this still goes on today with structured sentencing, is the legislature would say, no, we want to set the power. We're elected. Very often judges weren't. They are in North Carolina, but very often they weren't. So we want to set what the punishment is. We want to impose the punishment. You're just kind of there to carry it out, not to make decisions, not to judge, ironically. All right, now North Carolina slowly reforms its punishment. One of the ideas that comes about is that punishments should be proportional to the crime. And this is the idea of proportionality. That we shouldn't kill people for counterfeiting a coin. That we shouldn't beat people for stealing a loaf of bread. So when the American Civil War ends and North Carolina is struggling to be readmitted to the Union and is struggling really to reform itself in some ways, we have the Constitutional Committee of 1868, and here's a quote from them I think is pretty good. The barbarous punishments of whipping, branding, cropping will be hereafter unknown. Crime is often the result of ignorance of the means of getting an honest living, as of criminal disposition. Hereafter, a penitentiary will be at once a place for the repression of crime and a school for teaching the useful arts to those who are more unfortunate than criminal. So we begin to take a different approach to punishment. And previously to this, punishment was the goal. Now, punishment is there, okay? It's going to repress crime. It's going to stop crime. But you notice they didn't say punish crime. But also, sentencing is going to become a mechanism to fix the problem, fix the individual, to give him an opportunity to reform himself. So by the middle part of the 1800s, society has gone from the whole idea of the criminal justice system, when you're convicted, is to punish, 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 to now entering the idea that the idea is to prevent crime, great, but also to help these people, to fix them, to give them an opportunity not to commit crime again. Enter the federal Constitution. Now, there are no explicit and implicit limits on punishment. There's nothing in the Constitution, federal Constitution, that says you have to do this or you can't do that. You can do this, can't do that. But there are implied punishments. We have, for example, the Due Process Clause. You can't deprive someone of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. So one of the things we say about punishment is the way in which it's going to be done. Okay? Procedural due process has to be fair. Then we do have one reference, not in the Constitution as was written initially, but in the Bill of Rights that came after, that really talks about punishment. We have the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution. And it says, excessive bail shall not be required, comma, nor excessive fines imposed, comma, and here's the key words, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Now, again, when I teach constitutional law, one of the things I say is it'd be great if they had a little footnote there or an asterisk that said, this is what we mean by it, but they didn't. They left it for the interpretation of the society, for the judges that came after. So what's excessive? You know, when we talk about an excessive bail, if you earn $1,000 and Fred earns $10,000 and John earns $100,000 and Peter earns $1 million, well, for each one of those people that has 10 times more money than the previous one, an excessive fine is a different number. If you earn $1,000 and you get a $1,000 fine, that's really excessive to you. But if you earn $1 billion, a $1,000 fine is nothing. So when does a fine become excessive? And what is cruel and what is unusual punishment? All right, another thing that kind of shapes our view, and I had mentioned this before, is proportionality. We have the proportionality principle. You can compare the gravity of the offense, how serious it is. Was it a rape? Was it a murder? Or was it jaywalking? Did you steal an ice cream cone? And what is the severity of the punishment? So there should be some relationship between those two. That is why, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States has basically said you can't execute someone for any crime, basically, but homicide. Rape can be punished by very long sentences. If you steal a lot of money, you can go to jail for a long time, but we can't kill you anymore. It's just disproportionate. Not that it's not severe, but it's disproportionate. Sentencing and jury trials. Now, one of the things is a courtroom is itself broken up. Sometimes there is just a judge. That is called a bench trial, in which the judge makes the decisions about the law. He is what is called the finder of the law, and he's also the finder of the facts. He makes the decision. Then sometimes also there is a jury trial. Now, the jury doesn't decide the law. That's still up to the judge. But the jury does decide the facts. So if the factual question is, did Fred kill Bob? That's a factual question. If there's a jury sitting, the jury makes that ruling. Now, influential cases. We have a number of cases that really set limits on what a judge or jury can do. I think the Blakely case is pretty important. Judges can't enhance punishment beyond facts decided by the jury. So if the jury decides certain facts and that calls for certain punishment, then that's what it's going to be. But all of those, and I think I miswrote the Apprende case. I'll go back and check on that. But you essentially, because that seems to contradict the other one, you essentially are limited because each has its own sphere. Sometimes judges want to be crueler than a jury, and they want a longer sentence. Sometimes they'd like to impose a death sentence, for example. They're not allowed. If the jury in a capital case, a murder case, says, nope, we're not going to execute him, the judge can't overrule the jury. Now, they can make it, they can ameliorate, they can make the sentence lighter. Sometimes the jury makes a decision, it seems to point in one direction, and a judge can say, well, no, we're not going to make it harsher, but we're going to make it more lenient. All right, let's move on to corporal punishment in the United States. Corporal punishment, which is whipping or dismemberment, beating, has been abolished. Now, in very limited circumstances, prison inmates can be subject to certain types of corporal punishment, or things that border on corporal punishment, I would say, is probably more exact. But by and large, we have stopped inflicting physical pain on people, except in one place, and that's our public schools. Because we still have, and we're really kind of drifting outside of the criminal law, we still have a few states, and I'll show you a map in a second, we still have a few states where we have corporal punishment, where if you mess up in a school, you can be physically tortured, basically, or harmed. And here's the map. Now, if you'll notice that all the states in blue allow corporal punishment, and it's pretty much a southern phenomenon. It stretches a little bit out into the west, but you'll notice that none of the northern states, none of the far western states, California, Oregon, Washington, none of the upper Midwest states allow corporal punishment in schools. So, and we'll talk about specifically North Carolina since this course is being taught in North Carolina in a second, but basically there is a requirement that there has to be a hearing, and no punishment can be a shock to the conscience. So, for example, there was a case where a female student was, in a public school, was compelled to be naked when she was beaten with a switch or a stick. And the court said that was a shock to the conscience. You can't do that. There's got to be clear limits as to what it's done. So let's talk a little bit about how North Carolina does it, to give you an example. North Carolina does allow parents, first of all, to physically punish their children. There is parental authority. North Carolina General Statute 115C, Section 390.4, also allows a county, if they elect, to use corporal punishment. Now, there's only one county, as far as I can find, that allows public schools to do this. Now, private schools, different creatures. I know Sunday school, different thing goes on there. But North Carolina allows it, and there are certain limits. You can't inflict any, and limits apply to their parents as well. So, one of the big limits is there can't be any permanent damage. You can't hit someone so hard you break a bone, that you break the skin, that you cause bleeding. You can't do that. You can raise a welt, I would say, but you can't break the skin. So there are limits on this, but it's died out quite a bit in North Carolina. Well, one of the things I just referenced was, well, what about prisons? Well, the use of corporal punishment is not allowable to punish for past offenses, but you can use it to control current ones. Now, unlike school students, there's very little safeguard, okay? It's not permissible to simply beat them or whip them. And those have pretty much ended. The last record I could find of corporal punishment being inflicted by the state for a past crime was Delaware in 1952, which was a judicial flogging, and I didn't find much else about that. So that was the last time. It's pretty much ended. I mean, that's what now 60 years ago or so. No, excuse me, that's 75 years ago. Flogging has basically gone by the by. We do not inflict corporal punishment very much. Now, can you use force if prisoners are rioting, and can you see that as sort of punishment? Sure. Can there be a collective punishment like dietary restrictions, solitary confinement? Yes, although there's been charges about that. Well, let's talk about the punishment that probably focuses students and the law most still over everything else, and that's capital punishment, killing someone. There has been a big debate about this, and this debate has waxed and waned. It has become more or less vital over time. The Supreme Court, however, has never held that the death penalty is a per se violation of cruel and unusual clause. They've never said that you can't do it. Now, there was some limits in the 70s where the application was found to be bad, more due process than cruel and unusual. One of the things the court has said is it can't be applied to individual crimes like rape. It can only be applied to crimes against the state or to homicide. So you can see it theoretically for treason and espionage. That may be constitutional, but we haven't, again, there hasn't been, for example, a military execution for something like desertion. I believe Private Slovak was executed in the Second World War. You can't hold me to that, but and that's going on 90 years ago. So we don't tend to do that. Most death penalty cases seem to be solely for homicides. And the Supreme Court has really set up a process whereby it's done. And one of the things the Supreme Court has said is you have to take into account, if you're going to decide to execute or not, all the aggravating factors and all the mitigating factors or circumstances. So the aggravating is, what's the nature of the crime? Was it committed for money? Was the victim a police officer? Were there multiple victims? Was it committed during another felony? That's called the murder-felony rule. Mitigating things could be, well, how old were they? So, for example, the Supreme Court won't allow the execution of someone under 18. What's their mental record? What's the past record of the defendant? Are there mitigating reasons why they might do this? So here are some of the modern trends that we've seen. In 1994, President Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which tried to increase the federal death penalty. I say try to increase because it's still freakishly rare to be applied. And the United States Supreme Court has put some limits on the modern death penalty. The first one, I already mentioned this, is you cannot execute someone who was under 18 when they committed the crime. So no execution of juveniles. Even if they're 25 now, if they committed the crime when they're 16, you can't execute them. The next group you can't execute is people who were clinically insane at the time of the execution, or, of course, if they were insane at the time they committed the crime. Now, the mental retardation standard is one that's much more debatable because we have the issue of mental illness and the decision, well, what does it mean to be mentally ill? Is there a threshold, for example, in IQ? IQ is kind of a poor measurement of general intelligence, although below certain levels, it's probably not a poor measurement. But, you can't tell the difference between someone with an IQ of 110 and someone with an IQ of 90. But by the time you get down to someone with an IQ of 70 or 60, it's pretty obvious. So very often the courts will say you can't execute someone that fails this level of intelligence. Each state decides whether you have a death penalty or not. Some states have abolished it. Some states have retained it. Now let's look at North Carolina, where we all live, or most of the people taking this course live. And you'll notice that North Carolina only has the death penalty realistically for first-degree murder. and it's triggered if you're convicted with sufficient aggravating standards. And you'll notice that there was kind of a heyday of executions in the 1990s. They were suspended in the 1970s. There's two cases called Gregg v. Georgia and Furman v. Georgia that first, Furman then Gregg, first suspended the death penalty, then allowed it to be reimposed. So there's a lag there. And so you'll notice that there's not a lot of executions in the 70s, but then since we have more and more convictions, they start to increase. And then starting around the 1990s, they really drop. And if we go to today, 2022, 2023, 2024, we're executing only a handful of people, 1 or 2 people a year. And North Carolina technically hasn't executed someone since 2006. There have been death sentences, but not executions. And one of the reasons is, there have been some, you notice these death sentences there, but, look back. Okay, so you see where 2026 is between 205 and 207 there. You would think, well, some of those people would have been executed by now. Not really, because we've had great difficulty finding the mechanism to do it. All right, here is a breakdown of the death penalty. And you'll notice, again, this is not exclusively, but primarily a Southern, which a little bit of a pop up into the Midwest there and a little bit in the far West. It's primarily a Southern phenomenon. The South is completely, with the exception of Virginia, has the death penalty. So if you're in the North, the upper Midwest, the far West, California, Oregon included, there's not going to be an execution. And even in some states that have the death penalty here, it's very rare that you see it. All right, let's talk about imprisonment, which is not the most common. The most common punishment is a fine or community service. But one of the things that the court has said is that that Eighth Amendment about cruel and unusual does apply if the sentence is grossly disproportionate. That's that proportionality principle I mentioned. If you sentence someone to 50 years in jail for jaywalking, the courts are going to come in and say no, the federal courts. But they have a lot of discretion in determining sentences for violations. For example, there are states where it's legal to own marijuana. There's no penalty for it. There are states where it's a fine. There are states to where it's it can be a serious crime. You can go to jail for. So there's a few things that the courts have said. They've said, for example, you can't sentence juveniles to life sentences. So again, the court has been protective of people that are sometimes unable to protect themselves. Juveniles, and again, this is their terminology, not mine, the mentally retarded, people in difficult situations. Also, you can't put someone in prison if they can't pay a fine. One of the things that, particularly in the 60s that went on, was the courts putting real limits on using money to control people. And we're still fighting this. For example, in Florida, they passed a constitutional amendment that said people convicted of crimes can, after they've served their sentence, can now vote. Because unlike North Carolina, where you get your voting rights back essentially as soon as you're out of prison, in Florida, you didn't get your voting rights back. If you were a convicted felon, you never voted in Florida. Well, a constitutional amendment is passed that says, yeah, they can vote. But Florida has attempted to say, well, your sentence isn't over unless you pay the fine. And of course, you've got a bunch of people that went to prison for years, came out. Life can be very difficult. They can't earn the money to repay fines that were imposed as part of their sentence, and they've tried to keep them from voting. Hasn't been decided yet, but this is, the line that we deal with. At what point does the fine, if I can't pay it, become cruel and unusual or an ongoing punishment? So fines and forfeitures as punishments. Monetary fines payable by convicted offenders are very frequently used. It is one of the things that the government wants money. And the government does not like to, the people that run government does not like to increase taxes on people that can vote. So who do you go after? Well, you go after people that can't vote. You go after people that commit crimes. There's no sympathy for them if you're taking their money. So I was looking at Missouri, for example. Some small municipalities in Missouri use fines to generate the bulk of their money to run their cities and towns. In some cases, it's as high as 40% of their budget is from arresting people and fining them. So you're really running a protection racket. If you don't pay, you're going to go to jail. The Eighth Amendment does prohibit excessive fines, but what does excessive mean? It has to be determined by comparing what you did to what the fine is to how guilty you are. Now, there's also, as well as fines, forfeiture. Now, forfeiture it veers. Remember, we started this lecture saying that there's the criminal punishment, there's civil punishments. This is more civil. And the reason that's important is a forfeiture. And to give an example, let's suppose you drove a car in robbing a bank. You get convicted of bank robbery, great, you go to jail, but you're also sued civilly and your car is forfeited. So, and sometimes it's really a matter of paperwork as opposed to a lawsuit. Since it's a civil action, and it's used as a remedial purpose, then the Eighth Amendment doesn't apply forfeiture. So if I seize your car and that car's really important to you and it gets you to work and it's very vital, and you guys say, well, it's cruel to do that to me. It's excessive to do it to me because I was speeding. Courts would say, too bad, so sad. If the purpose is more than remedial, if it's a punishment idea, then proportionality might apply. So you can forfeit things like narcotics, gambling things, on-taxed alcohol, on-taxed tobacco, and the things used to ship them or move them, planes, cars, trains, automobiles, all of those. All right, let's talk about repeat offenders. One of the things people like to do or like to think to do is that you can lower crime by, when you catch someone the second or the third time for a crime, not letting them out. So the rationale, and sometimes it works for certain crimes, not all crimes, taking repeat offenders off the streets can reduce the incidences of crimes. So lots of cities and states have created career criminal programs, all right, to focus on high offenders. This is sometimes called the 6%. We know that approximately 6% of juvenile delinquents will grow up and commit far more crimes. The biggest problem we have is it's out of the 100 juveniles that you arrest. Most people who commit crimes when they're very young, they're never going to commit another one. They're at a high school party, they get drunk, they do something stupid like break in the high school and wreck the trophy case. I don't know, I'm making something up. They're not going to do that when they're 35, okay? But there's a percentage of that 100 people that are going to keep committing crimes, and we'd like to find those. Unfortunately, we don't have an exact tool to do it. Not all repeat offenders, of course, are viewed as bad. One of the worst group of repeat offenders, of course, is large corporations. 36 major corporations, and here's just a list of some of them, are repeat offenders. J.P. Morgan, Chase, which is a big bank, General Electric, HSBC, it's a bank, etc. Many of them have committed multiple crimes over and over and over again. Even when they agree to restrictions, they're very rarely punished. Typically, what a corporation will get when it commits a crime is an NPA, a non-prosecution agreement, or a pretrial diversion. These non-prosecution agreements really let the corporation say, okay, we're going to pay a fine or we're going to do this, but we're not pleading guilty. So we do tend to punish individuals. We don't tend to punish corporations as much. All right, so this brings up the concept of recidivism, the percentage at which you go back to prison. Every year in the United States, we have the largest prison population on the planet. We have hundreds of thousands of people in prisons and jails. And a lot of them get out every year. They serve their sentence. They get a 5-year term for burglary or a 8-year term for assault with a deadly weapon or a 1-year term for selling marijuana, and they get out. Within a few years, a lot of them, and we'll look at a number in a minute, are back in prison. And the rate at which people let out of prison wind up back in prison is what's called the recidivism rate. And the big thing we'd like to do is reduce this. In some states, what they want to do is they say, well, we'll just keep them in longer. The way you stop recidivism is you don't ever let them out. So we'll give them very long sentences. The problem is that gets expensive. One of the things that we do is if you have these past convictions, it's seen as a sentencing enhancement or an aggravating factor. So one of the questions I get from students is, well, how serious a problem is this? Well, roughly, the rate of recidivism in the United States is about 70%. Within 5 years of being released from prison, the odds of a felon committing another crime, not necessarily going back to prison, you let someone out for a serious crime like assault, and then within 2-3 years you catch them for drunk driving. Okay, so that would still be recidivism. The rate of recidivism is 70%. That's a high rate. So 2 out of 3. We also have, as an attempt to kind of combat this or deal with this, the 3 strikes laws. This is a very, very popular thing. It's kind of crazy in some ways, but it's basically patterning the judicial system after baseball. It's saying, you get 1 strike, you get 2 strikes, but on 3 strikes, you're out. Virtually all states and the federal government have enacted laws that increase sentences for people that have previous felonies. In most states, on your 3rd felony conviction, you can get a maximum sentence. And sometimes that's life. So the Supreme Court has looked at these, and there's been a question about whether they're proportional. So I was reading about a case not too long ago about a man whose he had 2 previous crimes, one for stealing an 8-track tape. That should tell you how old that crime is. And that's another question, like, well, how far back do these crimes go? But he stole an ice cream cone from a person. He had it in her hand. Now it can be a felony because it's from the person. So it's a robbery. And he stole the ice cream cone. It was his 3rd offense, so he got 25 years in prison. And he said, wow, this is grossly disproportionate. All I did was steal an ice cream cone. And it goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States, which is a very conservative court, said, no, that's okay. Even if the prior crimes were nonviolent, were relatively minor, you are a habitual felon, 25 years. So we have a fairly draconian or harsh system. Now, North Carolina has this as well. We have what's called the habitual felon law, in which we do this. We also have, for all our structured sentencing, when I did a report for a client to try to figure out if they're a criminal client, if they're going to go to prison, one of the things that I would look at is I had a worksheet that would calculate their prior record level. So one of the factors that went into that and into the aggravating factors was, were you convicted of past crimes? So almost always a past conviction in North Carolina led to a longer sentence for this. All right, on that, as I said, I'm going to go back and check that Apprende case because I think it's wrong in the slides, and I will let you know next time. But other than that, have a happy morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you, and I will see you all next time.